The morning I sentenced her, the sky was clear. I remember that detail because I have replayed it so many times since. The way the sun came through the high windows of the judgment hall, falling in clean gold columns across the stone floor. A perfect day. The kind of day a man feels certain of himself, feels the ground beneath his feet as solid as the bones of the earth. I remember thinking she didn't look frightened. That was the first thing that struck me when my beta Dax brought her forward. Most wolves brought before me in chains carried their fear like a second coat. You could smell it before they crossed the threshold, sour and close, a thing that clung to skin. She had none of it. She walked through my hall the way I had seen elder wolves walk through fire ceremonies. Eyes open, shoulders still, like she understood something about the moment that I did not. She was dressed in nothing remarkable. Gray undershirt, rough linen trousers, boots that were 2 sizes too large. Her wrists were bound with silver-laced rope, standard for a wolf accused of bloodline fraud, which was the charge my counsel had prepared. Dark hair pulled back from a face that was angular, composed, and utterly without apology. She was beautiful. I did not let myself register that. I was the alpha of the Vale pack, son of a high alpha, trained since I could walk to read people the way other men read maps. Terrain, weakness, angle of approach. I had been called the hunter for so long that the name had become something beyond title. It was what I was. I tracked, I saw, I judged correctly. I looked at her and I saw a trespasser with a forged seal, and I sentenced her accordingly. Ilara Voss, I said, and my voice filled the hall the way it always did, without effort, without theater. You entered the Vale territory under a false claim of kin right, bearing a seal that our records indicate belongs to a bloodline extinct for 3 generations. You have admitted, under counsel questioning, that you cannot account for how you came to possess it. She looked at me. She did not speak. This court finds you guilty of bloodline fraud and territorial trespass, I continued. You will be remanded to the lower dungeons for a period of no less than 60 days, pending further investigation. Any remaining claim to kin right is suspended. The hall was silent. She still did not speak. I struck the dais once with the flat of my palm, the closing mark of judgment, and I told Dax to take her down. She went. She walked out of my sight with those steady footsteps and that composed face, and I watched her go and felt nothing I was prepared to name, only a faint pull at the edges of my awareness that I attributed to the effort of keeping myself distant from a woman who was plainly designed to distract a man from thinking clearly. I told myself I had read her correctly. I was wrong about almost everything. 3 days later, my eldest came to me at midnight. Rhea was the pack's memory keeper. She was 71 years old, built like a river birch, thin and pale and impossible to break. She had been the eldest under my father's rule and his father's before that, and she possessed the specific authority of very old wolves who have outlived every version of arrogance they ever met. She did not knock at my door. She let herself into my study and set a flat leather case on the table in front of me with the deliberate care of someone placing something explosive. "I need you to look at something," she said. I looked at her over the report I was reviewing. "Rhea, it is past midnight." "Yes," she said, "I know, look." She opened the case. Inside was an ancestral scroll, the Vale bloodline record, one of the original 7 documents kept in the pack's sealed vault. The vellum was the color of old cream. The script in a brown ink that I had always been told was made partly from the blood of the founding alpha. She pointed to a section near the bottom, a branching line I had passed over 100 times without examining. I read it. I read it again. The silence in my study was very loud. "When was this last verified?" I asked. "The original branching line hasn't been examined since my predecessor's time," Rhea said. "We have relied on a summary document that omits the lateral descent. Someone, at some point, failed to carry the line forward in the summary. It looks like extinction because the main line died. But there is a lateral branch. She tapped the vellum with one finger. The bloodline did not end. It was simply not where anyone thought to look. I sat back in my chair, the seal she carried. I had it brought up from the evidence vault this evening and compared it to the original bloodline markers in this record. Ria's voice was entirely level. It matches, not approximately, exactly. The metalwork, the inscription, the layered ward seal, these are not forgeries, Alpha. They are the real articles. The gold columns of yesterday's sun seemed very far away. She isn't a trespasser, I said. No. The lateral line, what is it traced to? Ria said nothing. She pointed again to the scroll, to the branching line that moved away from the veiled descent and curved up into a connection I had not thought to follow. And I followed it now, my eyes moving along the vellum in the lamplight, and I felt something cold and certain settle into the pit of my chest before I reached the end of the line. The lateral branch connected, through 4 generations of careful naming, to the sealed lineage of the Alpha King's bloodline. The original, the old throne. She is the true heir, Ria said. She didn't make it a question, and you have put her in the dungeons. I went down myself. I left my beta and my council behind. I told no one where I was going, took no guards, carried nothing but a lamp. The steps to the lower dungeons ran below the main pack house, cut into the stone of the hillside, and they were cold in a way that the rest of the building never was, a deep, mineral cold that didn't change with the seasons. The air smelled of iron and earth. The cells were old. They had been used rarely in my tenure and almost never in my father's. Our pack ran clean, and we had built a culture where problems were solved before they became the kind that required stone walls and iron locks. They were not cruel spaces, but they were not comfortable ones. Low ceilings, narrow windows near the top of the exterior wall that let in air, and a thin stripe of light when the sun was at the right angle. I found her in the 3rd cell. She was awake. She was sitting on the floor with her back against the far wall, knees drawn up, arms loose across them. She had removed her boots and set them to one side with a neatness that struck me. A small clay cup sat near her right hand, half full of water. The tray from her evening meal was pushed into the corner, mostly cleared. She looked at me when the lamp light reached her. She was not what I expected, though I could not have told you what I had expected. Rage, maybe. Despair. Some version of her composure finally dissolved. Instead, she looked at me with an expression that was so direct and so patient that I found myself stopping 2 steps inside the cell door, the words I had prepared suddenly inadequate. I know why you've come, she said. You know. You found something in the records. She tilted her head slightly. Ria. Yes. She nodded as if this confirmed a calculation. I knew she would find it eventually. She struck me as someone who does not stop looking. I set the lamp down on the floor between us, which felt like a gesture, smaller than words, but more honest. I crouched down so that we were roughly level. I looked at her face in the amber light and I saw, for the first time, what I had refused to see in the judgment hall. The line of her jaw that matched the ancestral portrait in the Alpha King's sealed gallery. The very specific shade of her eyes that I now recognized from a bloodline marking in the record. The absolute steadiness of her that was not a performance of courage but something older, something stitched into structure. The seal is real, I said. Yes. The claim of kinright was not fraudulent. No. You never told the council. At questioning, you said nothing. I tried to speak to you directly, she said. Her voice was still even, but there was something under it that I caught now, the first note of something that was not quite anger and not quite grief, but was the shape of a feeling long held. 3 times, before Dax brought me to the judgment hall, I asked each time to be taken to you. I was told you do not receive unknown wolves seeking private audience. That was true. It was a policy I had implemented 2 years ago after an assassination attempt. I had not reconsidered it since. I did not know who you were, I said. I was aware of that, she said. That was rather my point. I needed to speak to you before judgment, not after. The silence between us held. The lamp flame flickered once in a draft from the narrow window above. I owe you an apology, I said. And an explanation, and a great deal more than that. She studied me. The patience in her expression had not shifted, but something else moved through her eyes, an evaluation, precise and careful. It occurred to me that she was reading me the way I read others, and that she was probably better at it than most people I had met. Start with the explanation, she said. I brought her up from the dungeons that night. She would not let me carry her, which I had not offered. She walked up the stone stairs herself, barefoot, carrying her boots in one hand. I carried the lamp. We moved through the empty corridors of the pack house in silence, and I was aware the entire time of a sensation that was difficult to categorize. A warmth and a pull that had nothing to do with the lamp. A sense of rightness that ran completely counter to the fact that I had spent 3 days treating this woman as a criminal. I brought her to the eastern parlor, which had a fire, and I sat across from her, and I told her the truth of what Rhea had found. I told her about the branching line, the lateral descent, the unmistakable connection to the Alpha King's lineage. I told her about the summary document that had omitted the branch, the decades of assumption built on an incomplete record. She listened to all of it without interrupting. You already knew most of this, I said when I had finished. I knew who I was, she said. I didn't know the pack's records had lost the thread of it. I assumed you were working from the same information I was. I wasn't. My counsel told me the bloodline was extinct. And you trusted your counsel. I trusted the records they cited. The difference matters, she said, and her voice was not accusing, it was precise. You didn't fabricate the charge. You acted on what was in front of you. That's not the same as malice. I looked at her. You're being generous. I'm being accurate, she said. There's a difference between those things, too. The fire cracked. Outside, the pack house was still. This late, the wolves had retired to their dens, and the building held only the settling sounds of old stone. I had never noticed how loud that silence was until I was sitting in it with someone who filled it differently than it had ever been filled before. The sensation at the edges of my awareness had not diminished. If anything, it was stronger, a recognition I could no longer dismiss as distraction, no longer attribute to the effort of keeping my judgment clean. It was something I had read about in the ancestral texts and heard described by older wolves with a reverence that I had always privately considered excessive. I had heard them call it the knowing. I had assumed it would be something I recognized immediately, a declaration, not a question. I had not expected it to come in the middle of a firelit room, looking at a woman I had locked in a dungeon 3 days ago, feeling less certain of myself than I had since I was a boy. Ilara, I said. She looked at me. I need to tell you something else. She waited. You walked into my hall 3 days ago and I looked at you and I made a choice not to see you clearly. That's the truth of it. I told myself I was being precise, being fair, following the evidence my counsel presented. But there was something I felt the moment you crossed the threshold that I chose to set aside because I didn't know what to do with it. I paused. The words felt clumsy in my mouth, but they were the right ones. I know what it is now. The fire moved between us. You understand what the ancestral line means, she said. Her voice was very quiet. Not just the kingship, what it means for the mate bond. Yes. You're telling me you felt it. 3 days ago, in the hall, I felt it and I sentenced you anyway. A long silence. She looked at the fire. I watched her face in the light, the way the angles of it shifted, the way something moved through her expression that was complex and layered and honest. Not the composure I had seen in the hall, which I understood now was armor, but the real thing underneath it, which was something that had been waiting. "So did I," she said quietly, "for what it's worth." I felt the words land somewhere deep. "I don't deserve that," I said. "No," she agreed, "you don't. But it isn't something that cares about deserving." I convened the full council at dawn. By then, I had sat with Rhea for 2 hours reviewing the complete ancestral record and the history of the Alpha King's bloodline. By then, I understood the full weight of what I had done and what it meant, not just for Alara, not just for my pack, but for the entire structure of the Wolf territories. The Alpha King's seat had been empty for 3 generations. 17 packs had spent those decades in a balance of power that was always provisional, always fragile, maintained through agreements and alliances and the careful management of rivalries. 3 wars had been fought in the absence of the throne. The Vale Pack had remained neutral through all of them, bound by the old oath my great-grandfather had sworn, that we would protect the bloodline if it survived, that we would never take a side that placed territory above lineage. My great-grandfather had been smarter than he knew. I stood before my council at first light, with Rhea at my side and the ancestral scroll on the table between us, and I told them what I had found. I told them what I had done. I did not soften either thing. My council secretary, an older wolf named Gret, sat back in her chair and pressed both hands flat on the table as if she needed the steadiness of it. My beta, Dax, said nothing for a long time and then said, "The dungeon." She was actually in the dungeon. "Yes," I said. "For 3 days." "Yes." He ran a hand over his face. "Alpha." "I know. If this reaches the other packs before we have managed the situation, then we make sure the other packs hear it from us in our terms," I said. "We do not manage this like a political problem. We address it as what it is." I looked at the scroll, at the clean lines of the branching descent, at the name at the bottom of the lateral chain. Alara Voss is the true heir to the Alpha King's seat. She walked into our territory in good faith, bearing a legitimate seal of kinright that our records had incorrectly dismissed as fraudulent, and she was imprisoned by this pack. That is what happened. We do not obscure it. Gret looked at me. "The implication for your standing is mine to manage," I said. "Not our priority." Dax leaned forward. "There's the other matter." He meant the mate bond. I had not told him. He had seen it in my face, the way he always read me, 20 years of partnership making words unnecessary. "Yes," I said. "Does she know?" "We have spoken about it." "And?" I didn't answer immediately. The long silence stretched, and Dax sat back and said nothing else, because he understood that some things weren't ready to be summarized yet. "She's in the eastern parlor," I said. "I want her given proper quarters before the council session ends. I want the original error documented in full. And I want the seal returned to her this morning." The seal was a flat disc of dark metal slightly smaller than my palm, marked with layered concentric script in the old bloodline language. I had seen it briefly in the evidence vault and had not understood what I was looking at. Now, holding it in my hands in the corridor outside the eastern parlor, I understood it completely. Not just the metalwork, which was extraordinary, but the warmth of it. The faint vibration at its edges, like a held note. The way it seemed to know, it was close to where it belonged. I knocked on the parlor door. "Come in," Alara said. She had not slept, I could see that. She was sitting in the same chair where I had left her, but there was a tea tray beside her now, Rhea's doing, and the fire had been built back up. The room smelled of wood smoke and the cold night air still in her clothes. She looked up when I entered, and I saw the same direct gaze and the same composure, but thinner now, the way stone looks when it's been under pressure. I crossed the room and held out the seal. She took it with both hands, held it in her lap for a moment, looking at it. Something in her shoulders released, a tension I hadn't realized she was carrying until it was gone. "It was my mother's," she said, And her mother's before that. I know, Rhea found the provenance line. I've carried it for 7 years. She turned it over in her hands. After my mother died, I knew I needed to find the surviving pack and present it. It took me 6 years to trace the lateral line myself. I didn't have access to the records you have here. She paused. I was careful. I thought I had enough. You had enough, I said. We lost the thread in our own records. That's on us, not on you. She was quiet for a moment. I need to ask you something, she said. Anything. The Alpha King's seat. She looked up at me. Do you understand what it means if I take it? What changes? I sat down across from her. The provisional balance ends. 17 packs come under a single authority again. The old territorial agreements get renegotiated under the Crown's jurisdiction. Wars become harder to start because there's a throne with teeth to answer to. And harder to prevent, she said. In the short term, some packs will not welcome it. No, particularly the 3 that have benefited most from the vacancy. I have no army, she said. I have a seal and an ancestral scroll and a mate who put me in a dungeon. She said it without cruelty, but plainly, and the plainness of it was worse than any accusation. If I am going to take that seat, I need a pack behind me that is not compromised by what happened here. The Veil pack is not compromised, I said. What happened here was a failure of documentation and a failure of judgment. We address it. We document it fully. We stand behind you publicly with every record we have before any other pack hears a different version. I met her eyes. And I will not ask you for the bond. Not now. Not while you have any reason to wonder whether you want it freely or because the political situation recommends it. She looked at me for a long time. That is the most sensible thing you have said since I arrived, she said. I have not been sensible since you arrived. Something crossed her face, not quite a smile, but the territory adjacent to one. It was the first time I had seen anything like softness in her expression, and it did something to me that I chose, for once, to simply let happen rather than track and categorize. I need to see the full pack, she said, all of them today. I'll arrange it. And I need a bath, she said, in that order of importance. The bath first, I said. She did smile then, briefly, and looked away, and I stood up and began making the arrangements that would change everything. She stood in the pack yard at noon. I had called the full Veil pack to gather, all 240 wolves, from the eldest Rhea at her corner of the yard, to the youngest pups clustered near their mothers at the edges. It was a clear day, the cold sun the same quality as the morning I had made my mistake, and I did not miss the parallel. I had written nothing. I have never liked prepared speeches for moments that require the truth. I stood on the yard steps with Alara beside me. She was wearing clean clothes now, and the seal was in her hand, and she had her hair down, which made her look different, less armored, more herself, and I looked at my pack and I told them what had happened. All of it. The charge, the judgment, the dungeons, the 3 days. The record's error, Rhea's discovery, the lateral bloodline, the seal. I told them that I had been wrong. I told them that their Alpha had looked at the true heir to the Alpha King's seat, seen her clearly enough to recognize the pull of the bond, and then locked her in a cell because he chose not to trust what he felt. The yard was very still. The Veil pack has held the old oath for 3 generations, I said. We protect the bloodline. We guard the lineage. We do not bend that for territory, for politics, or for the convenience of an Alpha who made an error. I turned to Alara. That oath is still ours to keep. Alara looked out at the pack. She held the seal at her side, loose and easy, and she let the silence do its work for a moment before she spoke, and what struck me was that she did not make a speech. She did not claim the yard or demand their fealty or stand on the weight of her lineage. She said simply, I need honest wolves. Wolves who will tell me when I'm wrong. My mother told me the Veil pack had that. She paused. She was right about very little, bless her, but she was right about that. That was all. It was enough. I could feel it in the pack. The shift, the recognition, the moment when a group of wolves decides that a person is real. Rhea, from her corner of the yard, made a sound that was not quite a laugh. That evening, the 3 elders from the Crestfall pack arrived without invitation. They had received word, the way packs always received word, through channels that moved faster than any formal message, that something significant had happened in the Vale, and they had sent representatives to read the situation before committing to a position. I met them in the front hall. Ilara stood beside me. I had not told her to stand with me. She had simply been there when I opened the door, and I understood from the way she positioned herself, slightly forward, shoulder near mine, seal visible at her hip, that she was making a choice about what this meeting would look like from the outside before it began. The lead elder, a gray-muzzled wolf named Brace, looked at her for a long time. He looked at the seal. He looked at me. "The rumors are true," he said. It was not a question. "They are," I said. "The bloodline is verified. By our eldest, against the original ancestral record. The documentation is complete." Brace looked at Ilara again. "You were imprisoned here." "Briefly," she said, "a record's error." "By the Alpha himself." "Yes, he has acknowledged it fully." Her voice was even. "If you came here hoping to find a contested seat or a divided pack, I would save you the journey and suggest you leave. The Vale holds the old oath. I am here. The seal is verified. If the Crestfall pack wishes to recognize the claim, we welcome that recognition." Brace was quiet for a long moment. "And the mate bond?" he asked. He looked at me. "That," I said, "is a private matter." Brace held my gaze, the long measuring look of an old wolf who had seen enough politics to know when someone was telling him the important thing. Then he inclined his head slowly, the old way, the formal acknowledgement. "The Crestfall pack recognizes the claim," he said. 11 packs recognized the claim within the month. 3 held out, the ones I had anticipated, the ones with the most to lose. There were negotiations, and there were tense weeks, and there was one ugly confrontation near the eastern border that could have become something worse and didn't, because Ilara walked into the middle of it and sat down at the table and talked for 6 hours without raising her voice. I watched her work during those weeks. I watched her read people, faster than I did, more accurately, with a patience I didn't have. I watched her remember every name, every grievance, every small territorial slight that had been accumulating since the throne went empty. I watched her make people feel heard in the specific way that made them willing to stop fighting, which was not the same as winning against them. She was extraordinary. I told her so once in a quiet moment between 2 sessions of pact negotiations, and she said without looking up from the document she was reviewing, "I know. It took most of my adult life to develop." She paused. "You're not bad yourself. You read terrain better than anyone I've met." "I misjudged you. You were working from incomplete information," she said, "and you had a policy about private audiences specifically because someone tried to kill you. That's not a character flaw. That's a reasonable adaptation to a real threat." She looked up. "What bothers me is that you felt the bond and suppressed it. That part I haven't entirely forgiven." "I know," I said. "You chose your certainty over the signal." "Yes. Hunters do that," she said. "They trust the trail over the gut feeling. It works until the prey is something that doesn't leave a conventional trail." She went back to her document. I stayed in the doorway for a moment, holding the quiet between us, the thing that had been building in all the small spaces between the politics and the negotiations and the long days, the fact of her, the specific gravity of a person who fit somewhere they hadn't fit before. "Ilara," I said. She looked up again. "The bond is yours to decide. I meant that when I said it. I won't press it." "I know you meant it," she said. "That's partly why I'm still here." "And the other parts?" She considered. "The work isn't done." It won't be done for years. No, she said. I know, a pause. I suppose you'll be here for years as well. The Veil Pack will hold the old oath for as long as it's needed. That isn't what I asked. I crossed the room and sat down across from her, and I looked at her face, and I let everything I had been managing and tracking and carefully not claiming stand fully in the open between us for the first time. Yes, I said, I'll be here. She looked at me. The seal was on the desk between us, and the fire was behind her, and outside the windows the pack land stretched out in the long winter light, and she looked at me the way she had in the dungeon, direct, patient, reading me, and then she nodded once, with the specific gravity of someone who has decided a thing. Then we have work to do, she said. The formal recognition of the Alpha King's heir took place in the Veil Pack's great hall, on a night in early spring when the cold had begun to break, and the air smelled of thaw. 17 packs sent representatives. The 3 holdouts sent observers, which was not recognition but was also not war, and was, under the circumstances, the best available outcome for the immediate term. I stood at Alara's left shoulder the entire ceremony, which was where I had been for the better part of 3 months, close enough to be useful, far enough to leave her the space the moment required. Rhea administered the bloodline rite, the old form, from the original text, in the old tongue that most of the wolves present had heard only in fragments. She spoke it with the precision of a woman who had been waiting 30 years to say it, which was true. She had told me privately that she had believed the bloodline would resurface in her lifetime. She had not expected it to show up in a dungeon. When the seal was formally acknowledged and the rite completed, the room held its breath for exactly 1 second. Then the Veil Pack gave the recognition call, and the hall filled with the sound of it, rough and low and certain, and the representatives from 12 other packs joined in, one by one, until the sound was too large for the walls. I did not make a sound. I stood at her left shoulder and I watched her face, the composed face I had seen in the hall on the first day, and then the tired face in the dungeon, and then the working face across dozens of negotiating tables, and now this face, which was none of those and all of them, which was a face I had not seen before because it had not existed before this moment. She stood at the center of a sound that acknowledged what she was, and she let it be real, and it changed her the way only true things change you, quietly, permanently, in ways that settle rather than shake. When the sound died down, she turned her head slightly toward me. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. I asked her later, properly. Not in the middle of a political necessity, not in a doorway between meetings, not while she was working. I asked her on a morning in late spring, when the pack lands were coming green, and we were walking the border line together, which had become something we did regularly, a habit that had developed without either of us remarking on it, the way the best habits do. We were standing at the edge of the old grove, where the Alpha King's trees grew, silver-barked ash trees that were older than the written records, that the bloodline text said had been planted by the founding throne. In the old stories, the grove recognized the air. In the stories, the trees moved. I had been skeptical of that detail. The trees were still, but the light under them was different, warm in a way that had nothing to do with the angle of the sun, amber and deep and quiet, the specific quality of light that falls in old, sacred places that have been waiting for something to return. I need to ask you something, I said. She stopped walking. She looked at me. I failed you before I knew you, I said. I had one job, the old oath, protect the bloodline, and I locked the heir in a dungeon. That is a specific kind of wrong that doesn't get resolved by political outcomes or correct documentation. I looked at her steadily, the way I would have wanted someone to look at me if they were about to say something true. I am asking you, not as Alpha, not as a political ally, not as the man who holds the veil oath, whether you would let me try to be what I should have been from the moment you walked through my door. The grove was very quiet. She looked at me for a long time. The amber light moved in the leaves above us. "You already are," she said. "I haven't." "You acknowledged the error publicly before it was politically necessary to do so," she said. "You did not manage the situation. You told the truth." She paused. "That was the beginning of it for me." She looked away for a moment at the silver bark of the ash trees, then back at me. "The bond doesn't ask whether we deserve it. You know that. It asks whether we'll accept it." "And you're accepting it," I said. "I already did," she said. Somewhere between the fire in the parlor and the sixth negotiation table. I just wasn't ready to say so yet. The thing that moved through me then was not the satisfaction of a correct judgment or the pleasure of a well-tracked outcome. It was simpler than that. Warmer. A rightness that had no edge, no calculation, no back door. I reached out and she let me take her hand, and we stood in the light of the old grove with the Alpha King's trees around us, and the pack land stretching out beyond. And I held onto the thing I had almost let slip through my hands without ever understanding what it was. "I am sorry," I said, not as a political statement, not as a formal acknowledgement for the record, just the plain truth of it offered to her directly. "I know," she said. She squeezed my hand once. "Don't do it again." "No," I agreed. And above us, in the oldest trees in the valley, something moved, not wind, but something that felt like wind, something that passed through the branches and the light with the particular quality of a thing that has been waiting a long time to release. And the leaves in the grove, silver pale and new, turned all at once toward her, the way they do in all the old stories. I had been skeptical of that detail. I wasn't anymore. The holdout packs came around slower than the others, which was expected. What wasn't expected was who moved them. The Duskfall pack had been the most vocal of the three resistors. Their alpha, a wolf named Cashin, was young for his position, mid-30s, intelligent, and deeply invested in the provisional balance that the vacant throne had maintained. He had built alliances under that structure. He had positioned his pack as a necessary neutral party in every territorial dispute, which gave him influence that the existence of a functioning throne would neutralize. I understood his resistance entirely. I would have resisted too, in his position. He arrived at the Vale without sending word ahead, which was either confidence or desperation, and I couldn't tell which when my gate wolves brought me word of him in the late afternoon. I went down myself, leaving Alara in the eastern study, where she had been working with Rhea on a territorial boundary rewrite. I brought Dax. I met Cashin in the front courtyard, where the afternoon light was going copper, and the pack house threw long shadows across the yard. He was taller than I remembered from the last interpack conclave. He looked tired. "Vale," he said, using the title, which told me this was an official approach. "Duskfall," I said. "You could have sent word." "I needed to see the situation directly," he said. "Not reports. Not intermediaries." "Then come inside and see it." I took him to the great hall, the ceremony room, which I chose deliberately for the history it now carried. And I had tea brought, which was a courtesy I did not strictly owe him given the months of resistance, but which I extended because Alara would have extended it, and she had taught me, over the course of a very intensive several months, that small gestures toward good faith cost almost nothing and return more than their weight. He sat across the long table from me and he said, "Is it true what they're saying? That you put her in the dungeon for 3 days and then stood in your own yard and told your pack you were wrong, before any of the outside packs even knew about it?" "Yes," I said. He turned his teacup in his hands. "Most alphas would have buried the record." "Yes," I said, "they would." "Why didn't you?" "Because Alara is not someone you bury things in front of," I said. "She would have known, and I would have known, and the pack oath doesn't have a clause about convenient timing." Cashin looked at the wall, the fire, The sealed display case that now stood at the end of the hall, the formal acknowledgement of the bloodline verification, installed after the ceremony, the original ancestral scroll mounted beside it. "The territorial boundary rewrites," he said, "the ones the heir is working on." "Yes." "Will they disadvantage the southern packs?" "The work is to re-establish the old boundaries that were in place before the throne went empty," I said. "3 of those will benefit the Duskfall pack. 1 will require you to relinquish a northern tract you gained during the Second Provisional War." I met his eyes. That tract was gained under terms that only held because there was no throne to adjudicate them. The heir is not reclaiming it out of politics. She is correcting what the records say should be the line. "It's still a loss." "Yes, it is." I paused. "You can fight it. You will lose eventually. Or you can bring the objection formally and negotiate the transition terms, which is what the old pack councils existed to do and which the throne's return makes possible again." I held his gaze. "Your pack benefits more from a functioning throne, with standing to adjudicate, than from a contested boundary in the north." Cassian was quiet for a while. "She actually sat at those tables herself," he said. 6 hours in the Greycroft standoff. I have contacts in the Greycroft pack. They told me she didn't leave, didn't send an intermediary, sat there herself all 6 hours." "That's how she works," I said. "Is she?" He stopped, reconsidered his phrasing. "The mate bond, your council's position. The Veil isn't compromised by it." "The Veil pack stands behind the claim on the strength of the bloodline verification," I said. "The mate bond is a separate matter. The heir's authority doesn't derive from my pack's loyalty to her. It derives from what she carries and who she is." I let that land. "The bond is real. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. But it doesn't govern how the Veil pack conducts itself, and it doesn't give the heir's claim its legitimacy. The lineage does that." Cassian turned his cup one more time, set it down. "I want to meet her," he said. "I assumed," I said. "She's in the eastern study." "I'll take you." I brought him to the study door and knocked, and Alara said come in without looking up. And I brought him in, and she looked up and immediately assessed him in the way I had watched her assess everyone. The 3-second read that went from face to posture to hands to the specific quality of a person's stillness. And I could see from the slight adjustment of her expression that she had made several decisions about him before he crossed the threshold. "Duskfall Alpha," she said, and she stood, which was the formal courtesy. Not a bow, not a lowering of status, just the acknowledgement that said this is a meeting of equals. "I wondered when you'd come directly." "You expected me," he said. "You're intelligent," she said. "Intelligent wolves come eventually to assess something in person." She gestured to the chair across from her work table. "Sit. I'll finish this section while you decide what you actually want to ask me." He sat. He looked slightly off balance, which I recognized as the standard response to Alara operating at full capacity in a space she'd made her own. She finished her section, 3 minutes of silence while the quill scratched across the document, during which Cassian looked around the study, at the stacked reference scrolls, at the territorial maps pinned to the wall with notes in 2 different scripts, at Ria's corner of the room where the eldest sat with her own documents, not acknowledging the visitor, which was a deliberate statement. And then she set down the quill and looked at him. "The Northern Tract," she said. He blinked. "You know what I came about. It's the only thing you have significant enough to risk a direct visit over," she said. "You're not here to challenge the claim. You've decided to recognize it. You're here to negotiate the terms of the northern boundary before the formal agreement is signed, so that you're negotiating from a position of choice rather than obligation." She tilted her head. "Which is exactly what I would have done. It's the correct strategy." Cassian glanced at me. I kept my expression neutral. "The Northern Tract represents 60 years of Duskfall land management," he said, turning back to her. "We've built infrastructure on it, pack houses, training grounds. 3 families have their permanent dens there. I know, she said. I've read the records. She stood and moved to the territorial map and pointed to the disputed section. The original boundary placed the line here. Her finger moved slightly north. The current Duskfall claim runs to here. The difference is roughly this corridor. She outlined it with her finger. The infrastructure is here, she pointed, which puts most of it inside both the old and the current claim. The contested portion is primarily open ground. Cashin came to stand beside the map. He studied it. The 3 family dens are in the contested portion. I see one in the contested portion. The other 2 are inside the original boundary. She looked at him. The one that's contested, if the family relocated to this clearing, she pointed, they would have comparable terrain, better proximity to water, and confirmed legal standing under either boundary interpretation. He looked at the map a long time. You've already worked this out, he said. I've worked out 6 possible resolutions, she said. This is the one that costs you the least and addresses the legitimate concern. I don't want your pack to lose land that has been genuinely settled and developed in good faith. I want the boundary to reflect the original agreement, which is a different thing. She looked at him directly. I'm not here to punish packs for what happened when the throne was empty. The vacancy was a failure of the bloodline, not a failure of the packs. You all made the best decisions you could with what you had. Cashin was quiet for a moment. You're going to be a very difficult person to negotiate against, he said. Yes, she agreed. That's intentional. But there was something in her voice that wasn't quite a smile and was adjacent to one, and he caught it, and I watched him decide something. The Duskfall pack will send formal recognition before the month is out, he said. The last holdout pack recognized the claim 42 days later. I will not say it was easy. There were more long tables, more difficult conversations, more moments where the outcome seemed uncertain. There was one night, near the end of the 6th week, when Alara came and sat on the stone wall of the old grove in the dark and didn't say anything for a long time, and I sat beside her and also didn't say anything. And the silence was the specific kind that doesn't need filling because it is itself a form of company. After a while she said, "My mother used to tell me it would be worth it. When it was hard, she would say, 'You are carrying something real and it will be worth the wait.'" She was right, I said. I know. She was quiet for another moment. She also told me the mate bond, when it came, would hit like a wall. I looked at her profile in the dark. Did it? She considered. More like a tide, slow at first, then impossible not to feel. She paused. You were a very inconvenient choice. I know. A slightly more convenient choice would have been someone who hadn't locked me in a dungeon. I'm aware. She turned to look at me, and in the dark her face was the composed face, and the tired face, and the working face, and the almost smiling face all at once. And I thought, this is what it looks like when someone trusts you with all of their faces at the same time. I'm glad it was inconvenient, she said. Easy things don't cost anything. They're worth accordingly. I didn't say anything to that. I took her hand and held it, and we sat on the old stone wall in the grove that was older than the written records, and above us the silverbark trees held their light, and the pack lands lay quiet around us, and somewhere in the far distance a wolf called out, a single long note, not alarmed, not hunting, just the sound of a wolf alive in the night, and neither of us moved for a very long time. There is a word in the old tongue, the bloodline language that Rhea had spoken at the ceremony, that does not translate cleanly. It is the word for the particular kind of rightness that comes not from perfection, but from repair, the rightness that can only exist because something was first broken and then addressed, the specific value of what is whole because it was once not. Alara had taught me the word in a quiet moment between negotiations, writing it in the margin of a territorial document in her clear, precise hand. Sitting on the stone wall with her hand in mine and the old trees above us and all the work still ahead, I thought of that word. I thought this is what it means. I had been the hunter for so long, the man who tracked, who judged, who trusted the evidence of what could be seen. I had stood in a bright hall on a clear morning and sentenced the most important person who would ever walk through my door because I was good at reading trails, and I had missed the only trail that mattered. But here was the thing about trails. They do not disappear because you fail to follow them. They wait, patient, steady, already there. And sometimes, if you are honest about the error, if you go back to the beginning and read more carefully, if you choose what you feel over what you were certain of, you find the place where you went wrong, and you understand that the trail was never leading to what you thought. It was leading here. Always here. She squeezed my hand once in the dark, the same gesture she had made in the grove the day the trees moved, and I held on, and the night was quiet around us, and somewhere the last holdout pack was preparing its recognition papers, and in the morning the work would continue. But for now the grove was still, and the silver leaves were silver, and the heir to the Alpha King's seat sat on an old stone wall in the oldest forest of the Vale, and the man who had been wrong about almost everything was, at last, exactly where he was supposed to be. The formal installation of the throne took place 6 months after the first recognition. It was held not at the Vale we had offered, but Alara had declined, because she was precise about what should and should not be associated with the Vale Pack's particular history with her arrival, but at the old conclave grounds, a neutral territory that had been maintained jointly by 5 packs for generations. A flat highland clearing surrounded by old-growth forest, the kind of place that had been chosen for important things before and held the weight of that history in its soil. Every pack sent their full council, most sent more than that. I rode with the Vale delegation. Alara rode ahead. I had not planned to be in the main ceremony procession at all. My position was a matter of some delicacy, still, in the politics of how the throne's return was being understood across the territories. But the night before the installation, Alara had come to find me where I was reviewing the final protocol documents, and she had stood in the doorway and said simply, "I want you at my shoulder." I had looked up. "That will be read as—" "I know what it will be read as," she said. "I've considered it. The bond is not a secret. It was never going to be a secret. The question was always whether we announced it on our terms or let it leak through inference." She looked at me steadily. "I would prefer our terms." "All right," I said. "You might want to wear something less administrative," she said, looking at the documents. I wore the Vale formal coat, dark wool, silver thread at the cuffs, the pack crest at the collar. I stood at her left shoulder during the procession, and I stood at her left shoulder during the ceremony, and I stood at her left shoulder when Rhea spoke the old words for the second time in 6 months. The bloodline right in the old tongue, this time with all 17 pack councils in witness. When the formal seal was acknowledged and the ceremony complete, the sound that rose from the assembled wolves was different from the sound in the Vale Great Hall. That had been a pack sound specific, local, fierce. This was 17 packs, 200 wolves, the accumulated weight of generations of provisional balance finally resolved, and it was loud in a way that went past hearing into something felt in the chest, the way very large sounds do. I did not make a sound. I stood at her left shoulder and I watched her receive it, the recognition, the sound, the weight of what the moment meant, and I watched her let it be real. And I thought about the morning I had first seen her walk through my hall and the specific choice I had made to not see what I was seeing. And I thought about the dungeon. And I thought about the parlor firelight. And I thought about all the long tables and the long weeks and the night on the stone wall. I thought, a man could spend his whole life learning to read the world and still miss the most important thing in it, if he is not willing to let the most important thing be something he cannot categorize. After the ceremony, there was a gathering. Food, wine, wolves from 17 packs filling the highland clearing with noise and reunion, and the particular energy of a thing long-held in tension finally released. I stayed on the edge of it for a while, talking with Dax about what the next month would look like for the Veil, letting Alara move through the crowd as she needed to. She had more people to speak to, more relationships to tend, more small acts of diplomacy to conduct, and she moved through it with the efficiency and warmth of someone who understood that this kind of work was never done. After a while, she found me at the edge of the clearing. She stood beside me and looked at the gathering and said nothing for a moment. "How does it feel?" I asked. She considered. "Like the first day of something very long," she said. "And the last day of something longer." "Both at once." "Yes," she looked at me. "That's the thing about thrones. They're not an ending, they're a responsibility." "You've always known that." "Yes, but knowing it and standing in it are different." She looked back at the gathering. "My mother would have been insufferable about this. She would have told everyone, any wolf within earshot." "She sounds wonderful," I said. "She was impossible," she said, "and wonderful frequently both simultaneously." A pause. "She told me once that the right person would be the one who made the work easier, not harder, not by removing the difficulty, but by," she stopped, thought about the phrasing, "by being worth the difficulty. By making the difficulty feel like something you chose, rather than something that happened to you." I looked at her profile in the late afternoon light. "I am aware," I said carefully, "that I did not begin that way." "No," she agreed. "You began as the difficulty." She glanced at me, and there it was again, the almost smile, the territory adjacent, the thing that was real because it had been earned. "But you became worth it, somewhere along the way." "When?" I asked, not fishing for reassurance, genuinely wanting to know. She thought about it seriously, which was how she did everything. "The yard," she said. "When you told your pack you were wrong before any political necessity required it, before the other packs knew, before it would have been discovered anyway." She paused. "That was the moment I understood who you actually were, underneath the certainty." "Not very impressive in context," I said. "It was the minimum required." "The minimum required is where character lives," she said. "Anyone can do more than the minimum when it's convenient. What you do at the minimum is who you are." She looked at me. "You stood in your own yard and told the truth when it cost you something. That's not nothing." I held that for a moment. The sounds of the gathering moved around us, and the sky above the highland clearing was going from blue to the pale gold of late afternoon, and somewhere in the forest at the clearing's edge a bird was making a sound I didn't recognize, high and clean and repeated. "I should have seen you clearly from the beginning," I said. "I had every skill required." "Yes," she said, "but you were using them defensively, tracking for threat, looking for what was wrong." She turned to face me fully. "I walked into your hall and you felt the bond and it frightened you, because the most important thing you'd ever read with your entire body did not come through any of the channels you'd spent your life trusting, so you overrode it with everything you'd built." She held my gaze. "That's not a character flaw. That's a man who survived long enough to have armor. The flaw is that you didn't take it off when it counted." I looked at her. "Next time I'll take it off faster," I said. "See that you do," she said. She turned back to the gathering, but she reached out and took my hand without looking, the same way she had on the stone wall, the same way she had in the grove, the gesture that was not dramatic and not declarative, just the simple act of reaching for what was there. We stood at the edge of the gathering in the highland light, two wolves at the beginning of a very long thing, and the sky kept going gold, and the packs moved around us, and the old forest held the clearing with its old patience, and neither of us needed to say anything more. Some truths are too large for words. They live in the held hand, the steady shoulder, the long walk along the border line at dawn. They live in the moment. A man who has spent his whole life learning to track everything finally stops tracking, and simply stands in the place the trail led him, and understands that arriving was always the point. I had sentenced her on a clear morning and called it precision. I had been wrong. And everything after that, the dungeon steps and the midnight scroll and the parlor firelight, and the long tables and the pack-yard truth and the grove and the stone wall and the highland clearing and this moment, right now, with her hand in mine and the last light going gold, was not redemption. It was something harder and more real than redemption. It was consequence accepted, error addressed. A man standing exactly where he ended up, after following the only trail that ever actually mattered. He had been a hunter for a long time. He was still. But now he knew what he was hunting for.